Special Operations Executive had not yet been formed when Mitchie was appointed Vice Consul, but by the middle of 1940, plans were afoot. On the 2nd of July, Dr. Hugh Dalton, the Minister for Economic Warfare, wrote to Lord Halifax of the need for a new organisation to perform covert and irregular operations in occupied territories. The contents of his letter formed the basis of SOE's thinking. Winston Churchill invited Dalton to take charge of the new body to control subversive warfare, commissioning the details of its founding charter to be drafted by an unlikely person in view of his reputation, no other than Neville Chamberlain. A draft was circulated on the 13th of July 1940, and by the 22nd of July, the War Cabinet had met and approved the charter. It was Chamberlain's final act for the nation, and it was he who named the new organisation Special Operations Executive. He succumbed to illness and died a few months later. By November 1940, Colin Gubbins had become acting brigadier and was SOE's Director of Operations and Training with the code name M. Brian Lett, the author of an excellent account of Operation Postmaster, who's joined us this evening, published 8 years ago after new archival material became available, believes Ian Fleming's famous head of the Secret Service in the Bond series was codenamed M as a tribute to Colin Gubbins. Ian Fleming and Colin Gubbins worked together on Operation Postmaster and other SOE missions, remaining friends and in touch after the war. M set up an SOE section in Lagos, the capital of Nigeria. It became known as W, West Africa Section. The remit of W Section was to make contact with dissident elements in the colony to try and reduce support for the collaborationist Vichy government in the French colonies of West Africa, and to endeavour to turn their support towards de Gaulle and the Free French. The Duchessa d'Aosta was a sizable Italian passenger liner which had arrived in the harbour on the 10th of June 1940, the day that Mussolini brought Italy into the war. The captain was concerned the ship, with its valuable cargo, would be seized by the British along with its crew. It was moored extremely close to the quayside, providing a bird's eye view from the British consulate, which was located right next to the cathedral. Through his contacts, Mitchie was able to get hold of a copy of the ship's manifest, which appeared to have one page missing. Both the ship's master and the Spanish Guinea government refused to divulge the contents of the missing page to the port authorities. The remainder of the cargo was valued at £221,000 and the liner up to £150,000, which is in excess of £20 million in today's money. There was a suspicion that armaments were listed on the missing page, and the ship's radio was still believed to be active. Fueling concerns, it could be used to track the movement of British ships and make contact with German U-boat submarines which were hunting British convoys. Mitchie also reported on 2 other vessels which had taken refuge in the harbour at the outbreak of the war, a 200-ton German tug, the Lecombe, with a small diesel-driven barge, the Burundi. There was concern the Lecombe could be used by the Germans if they could get her back into action. He also noted an increasing military presence on Fernando Po, with machine guns mounted at the barracks and other buildings overlooking the harbour. Both W and M began to assess ways to negate these threats. They started by strengthening W's team in West Africa, setting up a training school for Nigerian agents in Olokomeji near Ibadan. March Phillips convinced M to allow him to train a specialist force of commando agents for the SOE. Appleyard was a natural choice to join him. Recruitment was always by way of personal connections. Training took place in Dorset, and Mark Phillips requisitioned an old Brixton trawler named after the daughter of the fisherman who'd originally owned it, Maid Honour. While it had been converted into a yacht, it sufficiently resembled a classic Brixton trawler to pass as one. He liked the fact it was built of wood, which would mean it was less vulnerable to magnetic mines. With an engine fitted by the owner, it had the ability to sail fast and silently, and after being requisitioned, it was turned into a Q ship, belying its innocent appearance. It was decided the trawler would sail under a Swedish flag, though from a neutral country. They recruited Graham Hayes, a childhood friend of Appleyard's, who was an experienced sailor. He had the added advantage of speaking some Swedish, and he looked the part. Another maid-honour agent was a young Dane called Anders Lassen. He was determined to do what he could to take his revenge on the Germans after their invasion of his country. While training with the SOE and Iriseg in Scotland, he was recommended to M as a suitable candidate for the Maid-Honour Commandos. The Maid-Honour Commandos trained in Poole Harbour, where they were visited both by M and Ian Fleming in the months they were there. W and his West Africa section were having difficulties with the local high command. General Gifford's ban on bangs still stood. He and Vice Admiral Algernon Willis, Commander-in-Chief South Atlantic, were concerned with preventing attacks at the borders, particularly from the Vichy French, and also from attacks on sea convoys. They didn't want to upset the status quo, and certainly didn't want it upset by a team of irregulars from the SOE. Meanwhile, the Admiralty in London didn't think the Axis ships posed enough of a problem for such an operation to be necessary. M at SOE was working to convince them the threat was real. The Maid-Honour crew arrived in an ebullient mood after their eventful crossing and joined Appleyard and other agents who had set up a training camp on Lumley Beach outside Freetown. A cable from Admiral Godfrey in London was sent to Willis, and the Maid-Honour was instructed to commence reconnaissance missions, particularly looking out for U-boat submarine activity. But still, there was no approval for Operation Postmaster. W used his home leave to further the cause. March Phillips had convinced W it was possible to cut out both ships, and when in London, W was able to convince M as well. W also wanted to remove the ban on bangs and to build up SOE activities in West Africa. In this, he had the support of the governor of Nigeria. Back in Fernando Po, with Michi, who was not one of M's agents due to go on leave, M used this as an opportunity to place two of his SOE agents in the consulate, Peter Lake and B. Godden. Leonard Guise was tasked with measuring the chains in order to prepare exactly the right amount of explosives. It was essential each of the anchor chains blew first time round. This was a risky business, and Guise decided to moor his boat in broad daylight and in the heat of the day, row ashore in a dinghy, using the anchor chains as resting points. He had to use his hands and eyes to assess their dimensions and mentally memorize everything while looking like a tired man rowing to the shore so as not to arouse suspicion. Clearly, there was going to be an issue once the anchor chains were blown so close to the harbour. A considerable thought would need to be put into creating distractions, delaying the garrison from being alerted, and the harbour defences from being deployed. A few European British in Fernando Po, including the consulate, were under constant surveillance by the Spanish authorities. Acting Governor F.L. Sorrelus had inherited this system from his predecessor, who had pro-Nazi sympathies, and while Michi had become friendly with Sorrelus, he still arranged for a photographer to catch Sorrelus in flagrante with his African mistress. Michi told Sorrelus the affair had been brought to his attention, and in gratitude for saving him further embarrassment, Sorrelus relaxed the surveillance regime, making life considerably easier in the run-up to the raid. A series of aerial photographs of the harbour were arranged, it seems by Michi, who took an apparent pleasure flight with the governor's pilot around the harbour. The photographs were used to provide further intelligence for the mission. There was a great deal to organise, including the tugs and the additional men. Gifford was approached, and so was Governor Bourdillon. The latter provided the use of 2 government tugboats and their crew, but Laversat still needed more men, and he needed Gifford to agree to provide them. Unfortunately, they had an unproductive meeting with Gifford in Lagos, who wouldn't consider the operation without discussing it first with Willis. Laversat was in a fix. They needed the Royal Navy to formally seize the captured Duchessa d'Aosta and the Lacombe as part of the cover story. The problem was taken to M in London, who went to the Foreign Office, who sent a clear message back to Gifford in Lagos to offer all necessary assistance. Unfortunately, the telegram wasn't sent until after Christmas. Without the telegram, Gifford would not budge and persuaded Willis to object as well. However, London had already cabled Laversat to confirm the operation could go ahead, and he left Lagos for Olokomeji. It was essential that no trails could lead back to the British. The Royal Navy would have to be involved in the operation. They were to supply HMS Violet under the command of Lieutenant Herbert Nicholas, which was to capture the Axis boats as part of the cover. Nicholas and his crew were not in on the story until it had set sail, when Nicholas was to open a sealed envelope with the real instructions. Laversut, who remained in Lagos, was to send a dummy message to HMS Violet to go to a certain location to investigate unidentified vessels, boarding them, and ultimately bringing them back to Lagos. The seizure was scheduled for the 15th of January 1942. Lippitt came up with a cover story sufficiently convincing for Zarilla to agree to arrange the party for him. The Europeans on the guest list were all well respected and included a German couple called Herr and Frau Löhr. 30 people attended the party on the 27th of December, including all the officers of the Duchessa d'Aosta, but the German officers from the Lecombe did not attend. The crew of the Duchessa had copious amounts of wine and spirits sent on board. The casino restaurant overlooking the harbour was used as the venue for the party, which had an excellent view of the harbour. It was a great success, only finally drawing to a close at 4 a.m. Zarilla nominally hosted the party, but excused himself a little early and asked the rather vain Herr Löhr to settle the account and made sure he had the appropriate funds. To all present, it would have appeared that Löhr had hosted the party. Lippitt, of course, didn't attend and retired to his hotel bedroom, having masterminded an ingenious deception. But this was only the dry run. Once confirmation had been received of the new date of the raid, Lippitt had to set about organising another party, but this time he couldn't use the casino restaurant with its views of the harbour. Lippitt again persuaded Zarilla to organise the party, who in turn asked Frau Löhr to assist him with the plans, but this time somewhere less conspicuous. Somewhere they could all really relax and let their hair down without being so much in the public eye. She proposed the Valencia restaurant, and for this occasion persuaded the officers of the Lecombe to attend. All was ready. Lippitt could breathe again, but then there was a setback. While the tugs were heading for Fernando Po, the Valencia restaurant cancelled their booking. The owner's wife had fallen ill. This was almost disastrous. So Lippitt and Zarilla had to come up with another plan, and quickly. This was a small town, and the only alternative was the casino restaurant, which overlooked the harbour. Hardly ideal, but it was their only option. Fortunately, with only 2 days' notice, the restaurant was able to accommodate the large party. With no moon, the harbour lights out, and hopefully a lot of alcohol, and with an intelligently thought-out seating plan, the problem could be mitigated to some extent. With bright lighting at the restaurant and a very dark harbour, the guests would have poor night vision and would be unable to see what was happening in the harbour below if they happened to look. All it took now was for the Vulcan and the Nuneaton to arrive on the 14th of January, and at the right time. The journey from Lagos had been tough. The sea in the Bight of Benin was very rough, causing a number to suffer badly from seasickness. It took a couple of days for the sea to calm. Those on the Nuneaton suffered particularly badly. But this was not their only problem. The Nuneaton had recently had a refit, but its engine struggled. Apparently, oversized piston rings had been fitted, according to Bill. And with the Vulcan able to go at a much greater speed, the Nuneaton overstretched its engine trying to keep up. The Vulcan then had to take her in tow while they repaired the engine. A couple of days into the journey, Bill and Tony Abel, out on the sun deck, had been tasked with painting the full-block canoes grey, when the Vulcan suddenly swung to starboard, and the Nuneaton began keeling over. It was on the verge of sinking. Leonard Keyes and Bill clung onto the port gunwale so they could help Goodman, who was up to his neck in water in the wheelhouse. They prevented him from slipping into the sea, but couldn't save many of their provisions. The Nuneaton continued to be dragged along on her side until Bill saw a flash of an axe blade in the stern of the Vulcan. With quick thinking on the part of Anders Lassen, he had grabbed an axe and with a single blow cut through the tow rope. The Nuneaton was able to right herself, but it took some time to bail her out. They continued under their own steam, but the submersion hadn't done the engine any good at all, and after 12 hours it was running dangerously hot. They had to stop once again to cool it down. They reduced their speed after this. On the 3rd of January, some training took place, particularly for the volunteers, to ensure that they knew how to use both Bren and Tommy guns. March Phillips gave a full briefing to the recruits and assigned them their tasks. They were to capture and tow the Duchessa d'Aosta and the Lacombe as quickly and quietly as possible. The Babundi, moored alongside the Lacombe, would be taken as well if the opportunity arose. This slide gives you an impression of the task in hand. It was decided that Leslie Prout, one of the SOE agents, would remain on board to oversee the engine room of the Vulcan in case any panic was caused with the African crew when the explosives went off. By 5:30 p.m, the vessels were underway again. The idea was for the two fullboats to go ahead of the tugs to give them time to board the Lacombe and to overcome any possible opposition. It was imperative they entered the harbour as planned in the dark once the harbour lights had been switched off. What March Phillips and Appleyard hadn't realised was that Fernando Po and Spanish Guinea kept Spanish time, which offered by 1 hour from Nigerian time. There was a heated exchange between Guise and March Phillips, who refused to accept there was a time difference, and his temper snapped, ignoring Guise, who then placed the Nuneaton broadside onto the bows of the Vulcan, making it impossible for her to proceed without ramming the Nuneaton. There were furious exchanges between the bridges of both tugs, but Appleyard, in his customary way, was able to calm the temper of March Phillips, and they waited until the lights went out. Lippett's groundwork had paid off. The lights began to go out at Santa Isabel a little earlier than scheduled. The tugs entered the harbour, at which point they cut their engines. The discreet signal from the Reverend Markham's house, a blind raised and lowered on a light in the window by an unnamed someone, signalled the green light for the raid. Markham was away in Calabar at a meeting. The two fullboats were lowered from the Nuneaton. They took guns with them, and Bill was carrying plastic explosive charges connected with fuses wrapped in paper inside his shirt. Abel and Newington, somewhat groped in the dark, initially heading in the wrong direction until Guise called out to them and their course was corrected. The fullboats first came alongside the Babundi, where they met its African watchman, to whom Hayes handed a letter and bluffed that he'd come to see the captain. He was informed the captain was on shore, at which point another crew member appeared, but before any action was necessary, the second fullboat came into view, along with visible Tommy guns and revolvers, and the two Africans rather wisely jumped overboard. The two commandos, with Abel and Newington, boarded the Lacombe and started attaching the explosives around the anchor chains and crimping the detonators into place. They were not to blow up the anchor until the Nuneaton had arrived, coupled up, and taken the strain. Bearing in mind there was little time to lose, with the Africans swimming to shore to raise the alarm, they had to work quickly. Due to the unreliability of the Nuneaton, it was decided they should blow the anchor chains once they were ready, rather than waiting for a signal from the Vulcan. Heavily armed Guise and Buzz Perkins first boarded the Lacombe to attach the hawser to make it secure, but Bill, who had been working on the plastic explosives with a commando, whom he noted lit the fuse prematurely, realised they were all in danger. They took refuge behind the bulkhead, while Guise and Perkins were less lucky. They were blown backwards, with the Mills bomb that Guise was carrying blown out of his hand onto the deck about a foot from where Bill had taken cover. Fortunately, it still had its pin intact. Meanwhile, the Vulcan skillfully came alongside the Duchessa d'Aosta, with the boarding party awaiting March Phillips' order to board the liner. There were lights on board, but nobody seemed to notice their arrival. While ready and armed, there was real hope force would not be necessary on this mission. The initial party jumped on board, and Lassen secured a line, but the swell of the sea created a larger gap, making it hard for the others to board. The opportunity was taken when the swell reduced the gap and more jumped and boarded, with Appleyard taking a full 8-foot leap. A bamboo ladder then made a precarious crossing for the remainder of the party. Those boarding were armed with metal coches wrapped in rubber and with guns. But they met with no resistance, and in fact the first prisoner they took was in his pyjamas. They prevented him from raising the alarm. As with the African watchman on the Lacombe, the watchman on the Duchessa jumped overboard, while his colleague surrendered. One of the commandos, Captain Longe, met with some resistance from an unlikely defender, a pig which was running amok on board and knocked him off his feet in the dark. The explosives party, led by Appleyard, placed their charges. Realizing the increased urgency when they heard the explosives detonating prematurely on the Lecombe, they worked with astonishing speed to complete their task. But they were sitting ducks. It was only a matter of time before the alarm would be raised on shore. Meanwhile, the boarding party secured the radio room and brought the ship and its crew under their control. They found 28 Europeans, along with the African who had surrendered. There were only minor injuries when language problems caused the kosh to be used at one point, and the one woman on board had promptly fainted when commandos burst into her cabin. With the initial explosions, their time was up. This, along with the noise of the engines of the Nuneaton, meant they had to get themselves out of the harbour as quickly as possible. The sound of the bugle on shore raised the alarm, but there was total confusion. With the large amount of alcohol consumed, it had certainly dulled their senses, but people were out on the streets. March Phillips gave the order to blow the cables on the Duchessa, creating an almighty explosion, which meant Lieutenant Leslie Prout in the engine room had to work hard to keep the stokers calm below decks. The Vulcan took the strain, but could not remove the Duchessa from her moorings. Geoffrey Appleyard realised the problem. One of the explosives had failed to go off. He called out that he was going to lay another charge, and his voice could be heard quite clearly from the consulate by the cathedral overlooking the harbour. Lay the charge with extraordinary speed and skill. Dive for cover, and this final explosion released the Duchessa, creating an almighty explosion. Meanwhile, anti-aircraft guns were being fired from the shore. In the darkness, they had no idea where these explosions were coming from. By the time the lights of Santa Isabel were finally switched back on, the Duchessa d'Aosta, Lecombe, Bibundi, Vulcan, and Nuneaton were nowhere to be seen, shrouded in the darkness of the night sky. While the operation had worked pretty well, like clockwork, their troubles were not yet over. The Nuneaton was towing too many boats, not only the Lecombe and Bibundi, but some smaller boats, which they cut free, and the Bibundi was put on an extended line. By dawn, the pistons of the Nuneaton had seized up again, about 12 to 14 miles off the island, and they were drifting back towards Fernando Po. They worked feverishly to fix them. Had they been caught, they would have been treated as pirates or spies. They had another problem. The two ropes were damaged between the Lecombe and Bibundi, which was languishing 150 feet behind. A new line needed to be secured. In the dark, Graham Hayes worked his way along the rope above the sea from the Lecombe to the Bibundi, with the new rope wrapped around him. He made it, rested a matter of minutes, and made the same journey back, an astonishing feat. But their situation remained difficult, with the engine packing up several times, and all within sight of Fernando Po. The Vulcan was in much better shape. The Italian prisoners caused no trouble, and they were on target to reach the rendezvous area on time. They were aware the Nuneaton was in difficulties, but proceeded to the rendezvous area to meet HMS Violet, at which point March Phillips intended to turn the Vulcan back to assist the Nuneaton. However, unknown to him, HMS Violet was having its own difficulties, having run aground at Akassa, and was not going to make its rendezvous schedule. On reaching the rendezvous area, but with no sign of HMS Violet, the Vulcan cut free from the Duchessa, leaving their prize languishing, while March Phillips, having narrowly escaped death when misjudging the jump between the two vessels and landing in the sea between them, returned to check on the Nuneaton, which was still in difficulties. With German markings on her funnel, they were exposed to attacks from their own side, but he felt that leaving the Duchessa with no engine for any longer was more risky. He returned and left Nuneaton to chart her own course, which didn't go down too well with those on the Nuneaton. The Nuneaton eventually made the rendezvous area south of Calabar on the 16th of January, a day late, but found no HMS Violet. They continued towards Lagos, hoping to avoid being spotted by passing ships and aeroplanes. They were low on water, and the engine problems persisted. They were still at sea on the 19th of January when a passing ship did spot them, and to their immense relief, it was the Nigerian government collier SS Ilorin. They communicated via semaphore, and Hayes had to ask the master to pass a message of their whereabouts on to Lagos. Then the following day, after another engine breakdown, They spotted the government ship SS Adassa, whose master was a friend of Goodman's. They accepted a tow back to Lagos, which was a less than comfortable experience, with the Adassa making up for lost time, and the 3 boats she towed bobbing along behind, fearful they would capsize. HMS Violet had eventually managed to refloat herself, sighting the Vulcan and Duchessa 3 days later than planned on the 18th of January. They played their part by the book, firing a shot across the bows. The Vulcan was boarded, and Mr. Coker was arrested by a sub-lieutenant who wasn't in on the secret. And on the Duchessa, March Phillips demanded to speak to the captain of HMS Violet in a clearly English voice. On board HMS Violet, a message was sent to Laversuch. They then proceeded to Lagos, paradoxically arriving within hours of the beleaguered Nuneaton on the 21st of January.